our guest speaker, I think. So, Alasdair. So, welcome. So, Alasdair Henderson, I've been working with for more than 10 years, anyway. More than 10 years, and he's gone up and up and up in that time, and is now executive director of BAM UK and Ireland, get it right, and you've supported my research for a long time, and we've had a lot of discussion about EDI.
And some fun too.
And some fun too, yeah. So we've had a lot of discussion about changing cultures and EDI during that time, as well as our sort of research interests. So welcome, thank you for coming to talk to us. And he's going to talk about what they have been doing at BAM. BAM is a large civil engineering contracting company. So.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Becky, and lovely to be here this morning. So my day job is watching really talented people deliver great projects and creating a bit of sort of constructive havoc in amongst them. Trying to convince customers to give us work, trying to deal with the problems that come up every day and managing the sort of difficult things. So coming here this morning is an absolute delight. It's like being on holiday coming here this morning. It's just so nice to be talking about a subject that I enjoy with people that I enjoy being with. So thank you for that. What I'd like to do is give you the perspective of a large engineering employer. So I'm not an academic. I've never been an academic. I've spent my entire life in civil engineering, construction and infrastructure and buildings. So fantastic. The things we do, in my grander moments, what I say is the things that we do make real life better for real people. We build the fabric of society. So we build public transportation systems, we build energy systems, we create the infrastructure that allows society to exist and allows the rest of society, the rest of communities, if you like, to create opportunity, create employment, create wealth, and the things that make the world go round. And as a business, we're a fairly big business. So what I want to do is give you a sense of what motivates us, what challenges us in this space, what we do about it, because we've been working in this space for comfortably 25 years or more. I'll tell you a little about that large employer environment, what that looks like, and you can perhaps contrast that with your own environments. Give you a little insight into how and when we became interested in this topic and improving inclusion in our business, and then a bit more detail about the things we've tried in our business, some of which have worked, some of which have not worked, and to give you a fairly warts and all insight into that. There are so many aspects of that there's too many to talk about in the time we've got just now, but I'll try and give you some of the headlines. So first of all, as Becky said, I work for an organisation called BAM. I sometimes say to people, we're the largest construction business you've never heard of. We are 7 billion euros a year. We're a European multinational, largely UK, Ireland and the Benelux countries, headquartered in the Netherlands, 18,000 people working for us directly. But as is the way with construction, a lot of people working on our projects who aren't direct employees. So typically on any given day, we have 80 to 100,000 people under our sort of works control in any given period of time. So a pretty big sort of organisation. And I've been with the organisation for 29 years, so properly institutionalised now within the world of BAM. And my role is, as Becky said, Chief Executive of our business in Ireland. I've been doing that for 3 years. Prior to that, I was in the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands, I ran our global HR function, not because I'm an HR specialist, I'm an engineer by training. It's a long time since I've done any serious engineering, but because at the time we needed to bring our enabling services, and particularly our people function, much closer to our operational business so that the two worked better together. Our operational business was lacking the understanding of how you need people performance at the heart of business performance, and our operational function, or our supporting function, the HR business, was losing track of what it needed to do to support the business and be effective and impactful within that space. So some of you will have met senior executives from large corporate businesses in the past, and you might have wondered at that point how they got to be that way. And it is a funny sort of environment, and it leads to some funny kind of behaviours and things that become important to people like me that you might look at and think, why on earth is that interesting? I suppose the obvious place to start is that my business, the equity in my business, is owned by shareholders. It's not owned by me. It's not owned by my line management. I have one line manager who's the group chief executive. We don't own the business. Our shareholders own the business. I'm a statutory director, and the statutory director role If any of your people come to you and say they'd like to be a strategy director, do your very best to convince them, no, it's not a great idea. The privilege is enormous, it's a wonderful thing to do, and the punishment for getting it wrong is hideous and deeply personal and often involves fines and prison and things like that. So, it's a complicated environment, and the basic principle, the fiduciary duty that's placed on me as a strategy director is to make decisions that are in the best interest of the business and its members, brackets, shareholders. That is the primary duty I've got, which is really interesting because my shareholders have very specific sets of desires and requirements from me as a business, and then I have this huge other group of stakeholders that I need in order for the business to function well. And of course, amongst those are my employees. And the employees, I'm very fortunate. I've got a group of people who are brilliantly talented at doing all these things and manage all this complicated stuff for me. But our employees are interesting because they are, without them, the business is absolutely nothing at all. And yet they are not, in the formal sense of my role, my principal group to keep happy. But in the reality of it, they are a group that I must keep happy and understand and improve and get better with for the business to function and for it to deliver the thing that the shareholder's looking for. So I spend a lot of time canvassing their views, formally and informally, managing their development and their career progression, planning for succession in the business, and trying to find that sort of perfect two-way balance of the engaged employee and a performing business. And no surprise, the views of my employees are not uniform. They are far from uniform. They are about 180 degrees of opinion in my business when I ask employees what they think about different things. And that varies with demographic, it varies with societal interest, what's in the news on a given day. And of course, some of those are very contradictory. So I've got that overall piece of what the law says I've got to do. I've got this piece that says keep my stakeholders happy and interested. And then, of course, there's the kind of moral compass, the own bit. I do have to make money for my shareholder. I do need to stay out of jail. I do need to try and avoid getting fined. I do need to keep my employees happy. And I also need to be able to sleep at night. And that is the sort of internal moral compass that says, well, all of these things at once are some of the motivations that make you get interested in a topic like this. So finally, to wrap up on that kind of motivators and drivers in the corporate space, it's useful to talk about the sort of economic and social backdrop we have just now. Unemployment in the UK and in Ireland, slightly different in Europe, but unemployment in the UK currently hovering around the 4% mark. That is basically full employment bar structural factors. So there isn't this huge pool of people waiting to jump into the energy and engineering sectors to fulfil demand and create opportunity for themselves. We are absolutely in a space of, it's sometimes called shortage. In truth, it's really scarcity. And it's always been scarce. These skills are complex and difficult to achieve, and therefore the people who have them are rare, and we have to make the job we do interesting for them so they want to come towards us. So often when I bump into my peers, they wring their hands and tell me what a terrible problem diversity is and inclusion is, and how we're going to solve this problem of inclusion. And my answer to them is very straightforward. Inclusion isn't a problem for us. It is the solution to the problem that we have. And we have to see it in those terms because it's a really beneficial way of making sure that we access a much better population and a much more open population than the one that we've traditionally accessed as big corporate businesses. So I suppose very quickly I'll go into, where did BAM and why did BAM get interested in this? And this goes back a long way. Like a lot of businesses, we got interested in this space through no one big single trigger, but a number of things that were happening all at once. And it really did start for us, as it does with many businesses, and has its genesis in gender equity. In essence, in our industry, we started to notice, amazingly, there weren't very many women around, and that the population that we employed was not very representative of the population more generally. Particularly true in our operational teams, particularly true in our management structure. So within supporting functions, less of an issue. Sometimes the opposite issue, that we had single gender populations that weren't male, that were in a sort of supporting function. So that had been given no thought, no structure, and it started to dawn on us that this was an issue. And it came around for a few reasons. One, at the time, and this is, as I say, 20, 25 years ago, the professionalisation of what was HR in that time and became more like a people function was moving on rapidly. The idea that performance and development had its roots in people was starting to take hold in a very serious way, and businesses were getting interested in that. And of course, as you start to get interested in individuals, you start to get interested in the things that bring them to your organisation and help them perform. We also had really good data, we had good data on the basic things that we had there around gender. So it was very clear to us what our population looked like, and we could analyse that information and say, ta-da, here's the information. There was at the time an increasing number of women in our industry, generally, not just our business, but in our industry, and that had a self-reinforcing effect that was very positive. There was, I think, a shift in managerial attitudes from things that were very traditional, both in the doing business sense, but also in how you think about your employees, to something that was much more progressive, that employees were seen as being a very valuable thing in the business rather than just a resource to be exploited. And at the same time, we had the emergence of the evidence that we now take for granted around the performance of mixed gender workplaces being far greater than single gender workplaces, and the need for a business that works in relatively small margins in a highly competitive space to try and seize those opportunities to become more competitive and win in the commercial game. And of course, the big stick, I mean, the Equality Act in 2010 came along. Like a lot of things in the corporate world, it sometimes needs that big stick to hit you for a few years before the business starts to think, well, actually this is a good idea, and it takes its own life. It's as true of equality as it is of things like safety and other environmental performance, for example. It starts with a legislative requirement that forces the businesses to think about it. Yeah, and I think we changed as a business also. We'd gone from being an organisation that just wanted to win work and deliver it to one that understood our place in society. We were in society and of society, and it didn't make sense for our business to do things that damaged that, or for our population to be unrepresentative of the more general population. As I said earlier, we create the infrastructure that allows the rest of the world to function. All the things you see around you are created by infrastructure businesses, and they allow that creation of opportunity, employment, wealth creation, and those sorts of things. So that became a very important part of the purpose of the business, and I'm very pleased to say that we're a purpose-led business. We understand what our purpose is, and we cleave very closely to that. And one other, perhaps slightly tangential thing, but it has a very clear impact. Over that same period, we got very, very interested in improving our safety performance, which 25 years ago we were an order of magnitude worse than we are now. And then along with safety came well-being and understanding mental health, not just physical safety, but occupational health, mental health, and physical health. And as soon as you're in that space as an organisation, you start to be interested in individuals. And if you're interested in individuals, then how you get them to work well together, and how you create opportunity and equality and inclusion, as we now understand it, becomes a very obvious thing to think about. Part of your license to operate, almost. So, I mean, what to say around gender? You'll find what I say over the next 10 minutes or so. It is still very skewed towards gender, and that's because that is not a problem solved for us in infrastructure. It has got better, but it's far from being solved, and it's still a dramatic issue for most organisational businesses like ours in infrastructure and civil engineering who have that problem. We see some interesting things. I mean, as we've started to work more effectively on this, we see that the things like a difference in the underlying quality of female candidates that come towards us in our pipeline of recruitment, whether that's apprenticeships, graduates, mid-career, whatever it is, there is a difference in the underlying quality there. And we started to realise that is because women who are coming towards our business, choosing to come into infrastructure engineering, were making very conscious choices to be there. Whereas it was still the case that some of the men that were coming towards our business were sort of accidentally coming into construction. And as stupid as that sounds, it was a truth that they were being guided there by peer pressure, by career guidance that wasn't very sophisticated. And so we saw that in the pool, but in the actual intake, what we saw was that the gender skew was much less, that we were seeing more women coming in quite naturally because the quality was higher. And you see some of those odd effects starting to pop through in various places. As I say, apprenticeship schemes are a very clear area of that, where we now take in 50-50, not because we've set a quota, but because the quality of what comes towards us says this is the right thing to do. So I said, look, there's this obsession around gender for us still. At the time, it's what we had in our HR systems. We could only ask, or we only thought to ask one question: are you a man or are you a woman? In context now, it sounds like a crazy kind of question, but we asked nothing about ethnicity. We didn't even think about asking anything about sexuality or gender identity or anything like that. So we had this population that said, well, we know your address, we know what to pay you, and we know whether you're male or female. And that was the information we had at the time. And one of the first things that we've done, which I'll come to in our initiatives, is look at that data and try and be richer with those data and improve the quality of them. But our interest in minority representation and representation from other groups and understanding that grew quite naturally in the back of that. Starting with ethnicity and disability actually was where we first started talking about this, and then moving into sexuality, and then non-binary genders, trans population, neurodiverse population. It all comes very quickly after you start understanding the populations that you're interested in, understanding more effectively. And much of it coming as a sort of emergent order, not because there's a great plan, but because it sort of comes upon you that this is a group we should understand, this is a group we should talk to, and it becomes you become aware of it and therefore start to think about it. So it's a journey. Well, everything's a journey these days, isn't it? This is another journey for us. Perhaps one of the most significant learnings that we've had is that there is a big difference between the initial work we did around gender, particularly female representation in our workplace, and representation of minorities. And the difference is this. With female representation at a number that represents the wider population, and we're not there yet, we're about half the way there yet, at that point, women have a loud voice in our business. When you look at minority representation, and pick your statistic, somewhere between 5 and 15% of our population will be gay. We don't know who they are. Some of them are very clear about the fact that they're gay, some of them aren't. But what we do know is that population, even if they are fully represented within our business and have a voice in our business, that their voice is drowned out by the 85% of our population that says, that's nice, but that's not me. And you can apply the same thing to ethnicity, particularly when you're outside the Midlands and South East England. You can apply it to populations that are non-binary gender, trans populations. And you start to see the importance of allyship in this space. That it's not just about representation and saying we have the right numbers or statistics. To hear the voice and have the voice amplified is an incredibly important thing, and that's a hugely important part of allyship. It's not just a sort of warm, cuddly, let's be a friendly organisation thing. It has a very real function for us in amplifying those smaller population voices. So look, you'll understand from all of that and that kind of winding journey, we are far from perfect, and we've not answered all these questions, but we continue to work through these topics as they work for us in a performance sense as an organisation, but also as they work for our employees, as the demands of those employees change, as their interest in talking about who they are, their own identity and the rights requests that they have, but also how we make those groups work well together. So to the final part, what have we been up to? I mean, it's 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I adopted approach, slightly controversially at the time, that we thought that developing culture and awareness is the most important thing for us to do, and numbers and statistics will follow. And that was controversial at the time because a lot of our peers ran off and tried to recruit as many people as they possibly could from any minority group or any protected characteristic that they could think of and bring them into their organisation. And what we saw was that would last for about 18 months or 2 years. When those people would come into those organisations, they would live in that, what was effectively a hostile environment for 18 months or 2 years, get sick of it and leave. So going out and grabbing as many different types of people as you could just didn't work for our competitors, and it didn't feel intuitively right to us. As we've matured over that period of time, we have quite naturally become much more interested in metrics, in measuring the impact of what we're doing to see whether it's impactful or not, but only because we worked hard at culture at the early stage of this and trying to improve our understanding of data so that we could measure impact and be more structured about it as we came along. So starting with data, if I look at what we have now, I mean, we are okay, but not brilliant, is how I would say it. We ask a lot more questions now, and as if I look at the questions we asked 5 years ago to new recruits, they are different from the ones we asked 10 years ago. I mean, 10 years ago, looking at some of the things you put up there about this population here, we were in essence asking, are you white British, or other? And that was the kind of, that was the quality, sophistication, granularity, if you like, of the data that we were acquiring. If I go to our business in the Netherlands, because of some very well-meaning but slightly crazy legislation in the Netherlands, we are not allowed to ask a lot of these questions. And the legislation is there to prevent discrimination, and the impact it has is we have zero insight into whether any of the things we do have any impact on our population because we don't know who those populations are and we can't ask them. So there's some funny, the legislation is, came from a good place, but constrains our ability to understand whether the things we do have impact in Belgium and the Netherlands. The other thing we haven't done is deal with the kind of legacy population like me. So when I joined, again, they know who I am, they know where I live, and they know the gender I declared at the time I joined the business. But that is all our business knows about me. And from time to time, we contemplate the idea of a sort of census going around our business and saying, let's learn more. We haven't done that yet, and there isn't a great reason that we haven't done it, but it just tells you that there is something around the holes in our data that we still know we need to do something about. Second thing we did was engage external support, and I don't mean go out and get a load of consultants in, which is a very popular way of doing this, but we engaged at that time particularly with Women in Science and Engineering, the WISE organisation. They had a great tool, WISE 10 Steps, which allowed us to do a very simple maturity test internally and do some quick planning of how you improve this. And we used WISE as a resource, if you like, in the WISE 10 Steps in particular, to give some structure to our individual initiatives, and they were just individual initiatives, and get some sense of our maturity level and a plan to follow from that. And then, fairly evidently, the next step you go into is training, and culture and awareness was the aim around that. And we were very heavy, I think, on awareness development and formal training, and we made some very obvious missteps. You remember at the time, unconscious bias training was very in vogue at that moment, and everybody ran out and did unconscious bias training, and that failed, not catastrophically, but it just failed us. It had no impact at all in the way we were doing it, which felt weird. We couldn't understand why this wasn't happening because the content was good, it made sense, So we started to understand that training and development piece in the context of a commitment curve, which, if you like, commitment to this as an issue develops over time. It starts at that first contact level, and it goes through stages of awareness and understanding and adoption, and then finally embedment and becoming completely committed to the idea of this. And we calibrated our training to try and follow that curve. So at first contact, when people had no exposure to this topic at all, we did the simple stuff. We shared demographic information. We shared issues that highlighted what the topic was and why it was important for us to deal with it, rather than creating a sort of philosophical challenge for the population. We just informed them. We said, look, these are the things that are in our business. This is real. This is what it looks like. And you can move on from there to start talking about more complex things. The business case, getting them involved in networks, and networks have been very good for us. I'll come to that in a second, and start to talk about more complex things. And as you move up that curve, they do get more complex, and we start talking about, particularly in the case of gender equity, the invisible care burden. We start talking about reverse mentoring plans around that, and involvement in STEM outreach programs. For us, it didn't make sense to put people who had no sophistication in the topic into STEM outreach programs. Better that we get further up the commitment curve and then do that there. And what you realise then is unconscious bias training is like step 7 out of 10. So if you land it on day 1 for a completely new audience, of course it fails. Of course, they look at this and say, why are you telling me this? You need to lead them through that commitment curve journey. That was quite a profound moment for us because it allowed us to structure how we support and develop our people in this space and give them real insights to it. And once you've done that, it allows you to get a lot of the other stuff to work. Mentoring and reverse mentoring I mentioned. So we ran a reverse mentoring program, and it was brilliantly successful. It was absolutely wonderful. It was aimed at our senior executives. I would say it worked brilliantly in about 50% of cases. 25% of the matches just didn't work at all, largely because the senior executive just couldn't get their head around, why are you doing this? It was very interesting, some of the responses to it. And another 25% of them, I would say, very quickly turned into a sort of they turned into a normal mentoring relationship. But of the 50% that carried on, they were brilliant. They were really, really good. And my own reverse mentoring relationship was, it was laugh a minute actually. Some of the experiences you get from having a perspective reflected back to you that is not your own was just priceless, absolutely priceless. We found that very effective and very difficult to sustain because it requires a lot of engagement from the senior executives. They've got a lot of other things going on in their lives, and their ability to be interested in it does come down to their individual interests. So we continue to put a lot of effort into it to make it work because it's valuable, but it doesn't self-sustain. If we leave it alone, it just starts to drop off very quickly. So it needs constant attention and poking. Networks I mentioned. Networks have been brilliant for us too. They need a lot of enthusiasm. I guess you'll all recognise that, and they need good chairing to keep them on track. And there is definitely, again, a maturity curve that we see in those. When they start, they always start as self-interest groups, a population that is of the population that they want to discuss, whatever group it is, and they are talking about their own issues. And gradually they start to open up to people who are not of their population, and they are still talking about their own issues. The most mature stage, and the one that's the most useful for me, is when they become a part of the organisation that discusses business issues with a perspective of their interested population. And I can go to them with a business question or to talk about a policy change or something like that, and they will reflect upon it from their own context and perspective and give me back a perspective that is a useful business decision-making tool. The networks in those spaces, when they become that level of maturity, they're absolutely great, and they definitely do self-sustain. We had a good hard look at working practices. Construction is an environment where people work traditionally long hours, away from home a lot of the time, and as soon as you've got any kind of caring responsibilities, while we might say our door is open to everybody, as soon as you're 300 miles from home and you're working 12 hours a day and maybe 6 days a week, that door has closed, and it's really just a window and maybe even just a pane actually. But you get to that point that you've created a job profile and a working environment that excludes people automatically, not because you've chosen to, but just because that working practice has forced you to it. Immediately pre-COVID, we were doing some work with an organisation called TimeWise, trying to get flexible working to work in our project environment, not the office environment, but the project, the site environment. And that was really successful. I had people at the time telling me, we understand why you're trying to do this, Alasdair, it's great, but you can't really do this in construction. It doesn't really work here, it's not that environment. That was February 2020. By April 2020, everybody was working flexibly. They were at home. They were trying to figure out how they could be. So, sometimes it needs that poke to get things to happen. And flexibility as an organisation, it really, really works for us. Pre-COVID, flexibility was all about when you worked. Post-COVID, it has become where you work. And it is neither and both of those things and a whole lot of other stuff in between. But you learn some great lessons from it. And the ability to attract and retain staff, particularly those who have caring responsibilities, and build that into a fully ingrained working practice and job design piece, making sure our job design reflects that flexibility, you can really change your picture considerably if you are willing to make that kind of commitment. And you have to go through that hurdle of people saying, we can't do that here. You definitely can. There's not too much more to talk about. I mean, surveying and reporting, we do a lot of surveying and assessments now. So once a quarter, I do a pulse survey of all our population to hear how they feel about the business. We ask them 30 questions. They can give free text responses. The free text responses we generally get from about 25% of the respondents. So it's interesting when you read the text, you get a very particular view. People who are happy, people who are generally happy don't tell you about it. People who are unhappy tell you about it very specifically and at length. And so when you read the comments, you get this picture that is maybe 25% happy and 75% unhappy, and then you look at the scoring, if you like, around the questions, and it's a very different picture. We specifically address in those questions sentiment around belonging in our business, barriers to being in our business, and boundaries in our business. Do you work too much? Do you not work enough? And confidence in line management. So asking people to be very honest about how they feel about the environment they're in. Alongside that, we undertake a thing called a return on inclusion audit. It sounds very grand. It is quite grand, actually. It is a proper audit. We go through our systems, we go through our practices, and we use evidence-based interviews with people to try and draw out what actually happens in our business and what we do, and compare that with a benchmark, an international benchmark of what good practice looks like in this area. And that return on inclusion audit is there specifically to validate the business case that I've put in place around saying this is worth doing. We do this because it has many aspects that add value to our business. If you can then audit them properly, validate them properly, you can say that the business case stands up. If you're just guessing at it, it's nice, it probably does work, but you can't really validate it in any meaningful way. And we do that every 3 years and then go through a 3-year cycle of improvement, understanding what's come out of the audit, and it gives us great action points for how we get better before the next audit. And then, of course, we've got lots of statutory reporting that now is in place. Things like gender pay gap reporting, absolutely run-of-the-mill now for us, and a very good way of making sure that we can make improvements on that and show people why we are making improvements on it. And look, process change, I don't need to tell this population around that. Process change has been really important for us, whether that's recruitment process change, changing recruitment manager training, centralising control of job description, job design, and recruitment marketing. That's been very effective for us, getting better control over that and making sure the sort of weird and wonderful job adverts don't go out of our business. We don't currently do anonymised CVs. Our recruiting managers really didn't like anonymised CVs. You know the arguments. You can anonymise them, but at some point you meet the candidate and the bias comes in there. Does it work? Does it not? I think we're pretty agnostic about that, but we do make sure that we put our focus on generating high quality candidate pools in the first instance so that we can do something more effective with that. And gender pay gap, coming back to that, is really interesting. Every single time we do promotions or pay rises in our business, we take the proposal, we check whether it's going to close the gender pay gap. If the answer is no, it goes back. And it gets sent back until it comes back in a form that reduces our gender pay gap. And some of those things are just as simple as that. There's a lovely piece around disciplinary process. Our disciplinary process is great for behaviours that we've codified and said, do this, don't do this. Works brilliantly for that. It is not fit for purpose for things like harassment, where often the perpetrator hasn't realised or doesn't acknowledge they've done something, and the victim, because of the confidential nature of our disciplinary process, the victim is outside that. They're treated as a witness rather than being involved in it. And for a long time we've thought about how we might involve a sort of restorative justice type approach to this, which is more effective at getting perpetrators to understand the impact of their behaviour and involving victims in a sense of redress, and also making it more scalable. One of the problems we have with our current process is that a number of victims have said they don't come forward with complaints because they want to complain, but they don't want to get the individual into that much trouble, because the consequence of our disciplinary process is often demotion or leaving the business and things like that. So you get some very odd stuff coming out of that then colours people's behaviour as to why they are doing the things they're doing. You've got to be very careful with that. And at a leadership sense, I suppose from all of this, we build that into our leadership programmes now. So not only do we do conventional DEI type training with our population of leaders who are moving on to becoming leaders in the business, but we give them advanced training. We give them really good insights into the data, why we do some of the things we do, the decisions we've made, and why this adds value to the business, so that they can take that into their own leadership and development journey and apply it to their own thinking. So look, a lot of things covered there, some of which I hope you found interesting at least. And sometimes in this space, success can feel like, the definition of success can feel like avoiding failure. And that's not good enough. It shouldn't be like that. Addressing the negatives is hugely important, of course, but and truth, our corporate culture is always going to be defined by the worst behaviour that we tolerate. But creating and highlighting the positives that come from this is just as important. And for our people, actually, it's a much more compelling explanation of why inclusion really works in a corporate environment like ours. Thanks very much for your time. Right there.
So, thank you very much. That was very insightful. Right, questions. So I think we have while we're waiting for that, do we have any questions from Jim?
Thanks. I was really interested in what you were talking about, the flexible working in a project environment. Is that changed if you've moved back to a more hybrid environment between sort of physical and virtual?
Has it changed in the sense that we moved back to hybrid, or I won't say we've moved back to it. I mean, that came out of COVID largely. I think interesting, at the time of COVID, what we said to people was, you can't work here, so go home, figure yourself out, and we'll get this to work. And that was the message. So that was what people took on board, and they adapted their circumstances to do that. And then, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months later, we said, well, now you can work back in the office. And there's a population that said, well, actually, I've figured this out, and I'm just going to do this thing. And we, about a year and a half ago, we started having the conversation, which is a slightly different one, which says, look, flexibility does work for us, but we're no longer in the space where we're saying, you just figure it out for yourself. It has to be a conversation that says, what works for you, what works for the business, how do we find the right answer to that so that you are interested in staying here. It's definitely a retention piece for us. Our people, if you say to them, come back for 5 days a week in particular environments, the answer is, well, I can do this somewhere else for somebody else in a different space. I'll contrast that also with, we have a population of about, I would say 60 to 70% of our population never worked from home. They build things on projects. They need to be on those projects to build them. Not all of the people that we always thought needed to be on the projects need to be in the projects, but there are some, you can't pour concrete virtually. You have to kind of be there doing it, and that is a truth. And all through COVID, because we were, we were treated as an essential industry, we were building public sector projects and building Nightingale hospitals and all sorts of stuff at the time. We had a population that never worked from home, and you suddenly very quickly saw that split between knowledge workers and skills workers or trades workers. And that, every time we talk about flexibility and every time we talk about hybrid working and things like that, it generally is a passionate interest of 10% of our population, and 90%, the site-based part of our population, like the idea and want to figure out how it can work for them. I would say we're at a space now where comfortably up to 50% of our people now are able to work flexibly in a hybrid sense particularly. Just because things like skilled resources like planners, for example. It used to be a planner would be captured by a project, so they'd have 100% of the capacity of that person and they'd maybe use 75% of it. Now, because we've got the ability for those people to work across different places and sometimes work in a hybrid environment, you know that you can get 2 planners to cover 3 projects. And when you've got a shortage of planners, that's really useful, it's really valuable, and it stops that sort of resource capture that leads to inefficiency. I think one other thing on that is that we discovered some really interesting stuff. Our most successful flexible workers are in that age group 60 to 65. So they're pre-retirement, they've made a very direct decision to say, I'm going to wind down as I get to a retirement age. They have enough experience, maturity and all the rest of it to say no to things that will overload them beyond their contracted hours, and they're in a space where they're not trying to prove too many things to too many people, and it's more about legacy and contribution and helping and supporting. So that is our happiest and most effective flexible working population. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. That was really insightful. So I've got a question of 2 parts, really. So you obviously touched on a lot of things that you've done. So of everything you've done, what do you think's been the most impactful? And then of the issues you've got left, what's your biggest challenge and how are you thinking about tackling it?
Most impactful, I would say, definitely job design. So, when I would go to a site manager, and the site manager would say, I need a setting out engineer. And their job description would start with, needs to be an engineer, therefore degree qualified, engineering background. So, degree qualified, immediately a group of people out of that space. Engineering degree qualified, so at that time maybe 17 to 20% of intake to engineering degree courses was female. So straight away we're looking at the likelihood of this being a white privileged male engineering person, absolutely. And full-time, by the way, that was the other thing, full-time. So this is a full-time role, so anybody with any kind of caring responsibility, forget it. And then you look at, setting out, what is it? Well, it's kind of, it's applied geometry, and frankly, if you've got an aptitude for mathematics and are able to communicate, I can teach you how to use the instrument in the morning. And most of our setting out is done at the start of the day or the end of the day. So if I can suddenly turn that into, look, if you've got an aptitude for mathematics, any kind of STEM background actually is interesting. If you're able to be available at these sorts of times and you can be in the location we're talking about, we can give you the rest. And all of a sudden, the pool of people that we are drawing from, instead of being that very restricted engineering graduate full-time employment thing, is something quite radically different. Most of our people wouldn't recognise that as the most impactful change. They would probably point at the training because it's the thing they feel most directly. But definitely that in terms of how you access pools that are non-cognate, non-standard populations to draw from. What was the second part of the question?
Your biggest, I guess, remaining challenge and how you would have your thoughts on how you're going to approach that?
Well, I'll tell you, because it is the same one that everybody's facing right now. There's a decision in the High Court 2 weeks ago. We've got some interim guidance just now, which is not terribly helpful at all. There'll be some permanent guidance. Who knows how helpful that will be. That won't be the end of it. There'll be an appeals process. There'll be a lot to happen there. In a funny way, I look at this in a kind of sense that this is a sign of dramatic success when we are so expansive about the rights of individuals and groups that those definitions of rights bump up against each other in a way that we have to address. If I look back 25 years, and it's funny when you look at the US just now, it's kind of a crazy place right now, but even in the US, Conservatives right now are more liberal than the Liberals were 25 years ago. And that the shift that we've had in that space is profound and remarkable, and we should be really happy about that. It shouldn't be a surprise that as we deal with expansive definitions of rights and groups' rights, that we do come into some kind of conflicts around how that works out. And it's going to take a lot of time to figure that out. In the meantime, as an employer, I am caught in the middle. I've got a population, not big populations, but sometimes quite vocal populations who come and say, this is your problem and you have to fix it. And I think, well, is it my problem? Okay, let's have this discussion. And I've got the law that says, and now you can't do this. So some of the flexibility around the decisions we could make to help our populations and to get that working together thing to happen, some of that flexibility has been taken away. And I suppose culturally it's very interesting because you can see that this is a big societal issue. A lot of language over the past 2 weeks around things like common sense, and you can see that there's a lot of discussion to be had yet around how society reconciles itself with this topic, not just this particular one that's been talked about, but the general topic of competing rights and groups and individuals, and how you get people to work together. Perhaps there's this kind of odd aside to that. I had a really remarkable thing happen about 10 years ago when we were talking about gender equity in our business. I had a project that very quietly decided that the best way to avoid any problems around harassment or difficulties with men and women working together was to have a male-only site, not just to have women, just not to have women on their site, because that would stop all the problems, all this harassment stuff. We'll have no difficulty there, and you can see it. Okay, I understand why you think that, but that is the off in that direction answer to the thing we need to address is how you stop the harassment, not how you how you create an environment where it just doesn't happen because nobody's getting harassed. People are very creative, particularly engineers, very creative at creating solutions or finding solutions to things when their concept or grasp of the problem is partial. So, I think we're in a lot of that space right now.
You're running slightly late, but I'm going to let Tammy have it because you had your hand up ages ago.
I'm going to try to keep it quick. Thanks very much. That was very insightful. I'm more familiar with the power generation and manufacturing, so infrastructure is fascinating in that sense. So in terms of seeing the inclusive engineering from a gender lens, you talked about gender pay gap, you talked about harassment. What does the success or the end goal look like if you look at gender perspective from an inclusive infrastructure engineering perspective? I mean, you could...
Yeah, look, big picture, what does it look like? We still have, so across the industry, the numbers are typically in that around 20%, sometimes up to 25%. We have gender representation, male, female. I mean, yes, we have a non-binary population, but it's just as it is for this population. It is a sliver out of a population that's very big. We're at about 27% through some very specific things, and our gender pay gap we've been reducing fairly regularly by 2% per year by these very specific things we're doing. So on those metrics, that is good. But the main topic here is how you make sure if infrastructure businesses are, and not just constructors, but designers and policy makers, are making choices for society that get embedded into society and sort of baked into the infrastructure that we have. And it's incredibly important that the people who make those choices understand the experience of the end user of the infrastructure. So that is, it's stuff like lighting around stations. As a 50-year-old white male, I'm quite comfortable with some not very good lighting. It's a very different story if you're a lone female. It's a very different story if you get something else that makes you feel afraid or concerned around those circumstances. If you are, go out the road and find a construction site. If you are a wheelchair user, if you've got a buggy, if you're dragging bags around and you have to step off the pavement into the traffic to get round it, that is a failure of understanding of policymakers, designers, constructors, and the whole process of infrastructure delivery to take into account the needs of multiple people within society. Success in this space looks like policymaking, constructors, designers, executors having that multiple person experience in their mind anytime they are making decisions around what they're going to build and how they're going to build it. We have as many problems in the temporary building space as we do in the permanent infrastructure space. and making sure that that infrastructure doesn't, lowest possible bar, doesn't disadvantage anybody. Best bar actively supports populations within society, all populations in society, is very achievable in infrastructure, very achievable, but rarely thought about. So success for me looks like even better policy making and representation there to make the decisions better.
Thank you. I'm going to stop now, but you're here till lunch.
I am, yeah.
So we can, and we'll do a slightly later.
Super. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.